Welcome to What the F is Feminist Housing Plan. My name is Jessica Katz. I'm the Executive Director of Citizens Housing and Planning Council. I want to start by thanking our amazing sponsors and our board. We could not do this work without you. And thank you so much for your support, even for those projects that are a little edgy or maybe even profane. Thank you also so much to the brilliant Christine Quinn, who is joining us today. Chris is here doing double duty. First, she is here in her capacity as the CEO of Win, where she oversees a massive shelter system and social service safety net for thousands of women and their children. You may also know her from her role as a political pundit during this most political of years. And just a few days shy of early voting in New York City, I also want to hear from Chris on her perspective on feminism and public policy in this election cycle. We'll also hear from Sheena Kong, Senior Policy Analyst at CHPC, whose talent and drive has moved this project forward. She understood the somewhat insane vision of this project from the beginning, and I'm so excited for her to share the results with you all. I'll talk a little bit about some of CHPC's projects, and then we'll hear from Chris and Sheena. We'll have some time for Q&A at the end, so we encourage you to add your questions and comments in the chat. I want to tell you a little bit about some of CHPC's current ongoing projects. The first is Public Housing Revolution. So NYCHA is one of the major housing problems facing New York City today. And as we'll hear, it's also a gender equity and obviously a racial equity issue. However, we have a pretty good set of tools for managing NYCHA and for bringing it forward, but they've really been stopped in their execution by a deep, very well-deserved lack of trust on the part of the tenants. So CHPC went looking for models around the world where people were able to bridge that gap. And in the UK, we saw that by bringing tenants to the table and elevating them as decision makers in the future of their own housing, we were able to really move forward and to redevelop a lot of the public housing there to a much higher standard of living than what NYCHA residents are suffering through today. We also have an ongoing project for about 10 years now about basement apartment conversions. New Yorkers are living in basements, whether we like it or not, and yet the thicket of regulations that govern those apartments that are making them less safe and less habitable today continues. And we really think it's time for that to change. So you can take a look at our website for some of the recommendations we have around changing the regulations around basements to make them safer and more habitable. A couple of months ago, I wrote an op-ed that the Daily News entitled "Brutal Bureaucracy," and the title stuck. So we are working on a variety of different ways to improve the process for the New Yorkers who need government's help the most in order to make their lives a little bit easier, and for our social safety net to be focused on results and on helping people rather than on dotting the I's and crossing the T's. So stay tuned for more on that in this upcoming year. So then finally, that brings us to New York City's new lens for New York City's housing plan. As many of you know, I spent many years working for the city, kind of running the units factory, helping to put forward and implement the mayor's housing plans, 2 of them actually. And it's an amazing sense of purpose that those housing agencies have, and it brings a real clarity to the work that they do and a real measurable results. However, that's not a fully fledged housing policy. So what we started to think about when I moved over to CHPC is what should the mayor's next housing plan look like in a way that more fully captures what housing policy can do, that more fully expresses what the plan is for, who it's for, and what we're trying to accomplish. So what if the purpose of the housing plan wasn't just to create or preserve a certain number of units? What if it was to improve the health of New Yorkers? Then it wouldn't be Chapter 1 new construction, Chapter 2 preservation. It would be Chapter 1 asthma, Chapter 2 lead, Chapter 3 COVID. So we're writing a series of housing plans to try to encourage the next mayor and all the candidates running now to get creative about what their next housing plan should look like and what it can accomplish. So we've published our housing plan for a city of immigrants and our RX for housing plan for healthcare. And today you've all just gotten an email with the unveiling of our feminist housing plan. So today's What the F is Feminist Housing was released today. It's available on our website. When I told people that we were writing a feminist housing plan, many of you were very supportive, but most of the time I got kind of a look that I could only read as, what the F does that mean? So we decided to lean into it and keep that title. And my hope today is that you come away with a deeper sense of the history of public policy in the US, how our safety net has gender equity implications, sometimes by design, and sometimes just out of thoughtlessness or the assumption that men's experiences are the default. We wanted to frame the city's housing problems in a new way, but also to bridge the gap between rhetoric and the daily realities of running city government and executing a housing plan. So many of you instinctively understand what we mean when we say things like a gender equity lens, and I'm so glad to have you here as fellow travelers. But I hope we also have some of you in the audience today for whom that phrase maybe doesn't resonate, and you're looking to hear some concrete solutions to what it means to consider a feminist housing policy. So we're excited to launch our Feminist Housing Plan report today. We worked hard to include both a solid theoretical and historical grounding, as well as a specific concrete plan that spells out what feminism and gender equity in housing would look like in action in the real world. So without further ado, I want to introduce our first speaker, Christine Quinn. Chris, thank you so much for joining us and welcome.
Well, thank you, Jessica, and thank you, everybody on your team who's not just done the Feminist Housing Plan, but done the other ones and the ones that are to come. And from my perspective as the president and CEO of WIN, Women in Need, and we are the largest provider of shelter and supportive housing to homeless families with children. We house about 5,000 people a night, 2,500 to 2,700 of whom are children throughout the 5 boroughs, and provide at our sites an array of holistic wraparound services. But obviously our biggest job is to make sure our families are ready to leave shelter and thrive independently and not return to shelter. And let me just say, I don't think we talk enough in this city about the return to shelter. One of the things that keeps the numbers of homeless people up in shelter is people and families who are coming back a second or third or fourth time. We surveyed our families at one point about a year ago and found that 47% of them had been in unstable housing conditions before entering WIN. So this kind of repeat visit is a very real phenomenon that is obviously a negative phenomenon, but particularly negative for children because it's yet another trauma that they are forced to go through. Now, we have outstanding staff at WIN who are our housing coordinators, our real estate agents, if you will, who work on getting folks out of housing. I started at WIN about 5 years ago. The average length of stay was 11 months then. It's now 16 months. Why has it gotten longer? Because the exit door out of shelter is not wide enough. So one thing you take from that is that there is simply not enough housing stock that is affordable to families leaving shelter. Now, a week or two ago, the council took steps at WIN's urging and real leadership, made an important move. We were supported by REBNY and people in the real estate industry, as well as 80 other homeless service groups, the UFT, Make the Road, a diverse coalition, and that legislation will raise the amount of money in the city's housing voucher to basically the Section 8 level of about $2,200 a month for a family of 4, and that's really going to help our families find places to live where they can afford the rent. But if you take a step back and look at what causes homelessness, yes, eviction is a big driver, but what leads to that eviction? Yes, not having enough money to pay the rent, but what else leads to that eviction? Domestic violence, working minimum wage jobs, battling with substance abuse or mental health issues, being able to pay the rent, but not also pay for childcare and then losing your job. These issues and others need to be part of the next mayor's housing plan. Because you can, as Jessica says, do the unit count and have a countless number of units that could be affordable to a family exiting shelter. But if that takes not just 30%, which is a made up number, it used to be 25, which is probably a made up number too. I remember my father telling me, 1 week's pay is your rent, from the Larry Quinn School of How to Live. I'm not sure that's how we should base things. Anyhow, it's 30 now. If that takes up all the money and there's no money for childcare, there's no work, and then the family is not going to be able to stay in their apartment. So why, when we're thinking of building units that homeless people can afford, for example, why aren't we thinking of citing city subsidized childcare in or near that building? Why aren't we calibrating the number of homeless people, the number of units, and the number of childcare subsidized vouchers and programs out there? In my opinion, it's because every mayor, not just this mayor, has looked at homelessness as an issue to keep off of the cover of the New York Post. They've never believed they could end homelessness. They've never believed that. If you believe that, then you start to put all of these different pieces together and make a holistic community structure that will support people. At Wynn, on a yearly basis, usually we put out a report called The Forgotten Face of Homelessness. We use that title because although there are 65 to 70% of the people in shelter are families with children, most people don't know that, and most people don't think about that, and it doesn't get covered enough by the press, and therefore doesn't get followed up enough by policy makers. But in our first Forgotten Face report, we called for one senior, czarina position that focused on housing and homelessness together. And we got a huge pushback from Alicia Glenn saying, that's what my office does. No, it wasn't. No, it isn't. No, they don't. Look at our structure. The Department of Housing Preservation and Development reports to one deputy mayor. The Department of Homeless Services reports to another deputy mayor, when the two should be working together to try to solve these problems with the Department of Building, with ACS, with the Department of Health on childcare. And if you raise these kinds of issues around locating near subsidized housing, et cetera, to say a Department of Health, they look at you like I have 12 heads. It's so beyond their capacity. Now, let me say one more thing just to put something into context. The Housing Authority is the holy grail for a Wynn client. If I said to a Wynn client today, we can get you with your voucher, we can get you an apartment that has, 2-bedroom, more than enough space, near a subway, blah, blah, blah. Or you have to stay in shelter 3 more months and you'll get a unit in a housing authority building. Absolutely every single one will wait the 3 months for the housing authority building, because that is forever, and they don't have the fear of a private landlord. That is the reality, even with NYCHA being in the shape that it is in. I believe that puts even a greater obligation on all of us to change the situation at NYCHA and get those buildings in shape and get them thriving with community centers, with the child health clinics that used to thrive in them, and really make them hubs in the community, which will require money and tough conversations about what we're going to do around the open space at NYCHA. But look, there aren't any easy answers to housing questions. And all of us know that, who've worked more than 5 minutes in the area of housing, but they're the ones the next mayor needs to take on, if in fact the next mayor wants this to be a city that is a diverse economic city that has opportunities for everyone, particularly for women. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Chris. And thanks everybody for joining us today. My name is Sheena Kong, and I'm a senior policy analyst at CHPC. And I'm really excited to share with you guys our Feminist Housing Plan, which just came out today. So I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen and we can get started. Alrighty, great. So we began this crazy, but not so crazy, as we'll see, effort with looking back at history and how history has shaped gender inequality in the US and how public policy has played an important role in that. There's a very not so brief, although we called it a brief, feminist history of public policy in the US. Turned out to be much longer than we expected. So if you're interested in this stuff, you can read through the whole section in the housing plan. I'll just give you a little bit of an overview to kind of provide some context for our plan before we go into the recommendations. So to begin, we kind of have to look really far back, essentially, to the beginning of the 20th century, because prior to that, prior to, say, the mid 1900s or the mid 1800s, America was structured very differently. The concepts of work and family were structured very differently. Most households were intergenerational and would operate a farm or some type of business to kind of collectively sustain their livelihood. And industrialization brought wage labor, which then in turn allowed for men to get married earlier on, support their own families, and not have to wait to inherit the family enterprise. So essentially, the rise of wage labor during industrialization also helped to trigger the growth of nuclear family households and public policy that promoted and supported that household configuration over others. Now, during this same time, because women were no longer having to contribute to family businesses in the same way that they did before, although I'll be clear, this was mostly only applicable to upper middle class white women. There was also this growing discourse around domesticity and what women's role is in the world of the male breadwinner. And this focused on caregiving and motherhood as kind of the true womanhood began to emerge. So the reason that I think it's really important to start at this period is because this is when the economic and social policy infrastructure of the US as we know it today was formed. So the progressive era, the turn of the 20th century, was a time of unprecedented urbanization, industrialization. People were living differently. Surging immigration was bringing more people than ever before to cities like New York. At the same time, the very dangerous working and living conditions that many of those workers were experiencing was attracting more attention. And progressive era social reformers were really interested in figuring out answers to questions like, how much money do you need to earn a decent living? And what is a decent standard of living? And so this kind of birthed American economic policy as we know it. It's important that this happened during that time because it was also a time characterized by a separate spheres ideology, where people believed that women's sphere was in the home and men's sphere was in the public realm, and that women should exclusively focus on their caregiving duties as mothers and as caretakers for their husbands, and should not work or be involved in the paid economy that was the men's world. And so when we were creating these first labor laws and our first economic policies as a nation, that was the rhetoric. And so that really defined how gender inequality continues to persist in our economic policies today. So the first labor laws in the US actually exclusively regulated women's work. And those laws, although they were for minimum wages and work hours maximums, were essentially designed to remove women from the labor force so that they could focus on their role as mothers, which was thought to be for the sake of the public good. Unfortunately, the attainability of the male breadwinner model, where a woman stays home and does the caregiving and a man goes to work, was not really supported for most households by the wages that men were actually receiving. And in particular, women of color were often excluded from the policies that were supposed to protect women as mothers. In fact, a lot of times white families would rely on caregiving from women of color who were employed as domestic servants in order to achieve the kind of male breadwinner ideal. And so it wasn't exactly as simple as the mom is taking care of stuff and the dad is working. A lot of scholars also argue that the social welfare policies created during this time founded or formed the foundation for the welfare state as we know it, and that the bifurcated or two-channel, as some people call it, welfare state, the seeds of that were really planted during this time. So men were entitled to public benefits as workers, such as workmen's compensation or unemployment when it got to the New Deal, Social Security insurance, etc. Public assistance, or what we now know as welfare, was always designed to support women, but it was not an entitlement. It was a payment given in exchange for the service to society of providing good mothering. And so public assistance programs early on were designed to serve only the most deserving women who were widows or who weren't able to rely on their male providers anymore, rather than women who had not conformed or attempted to conform to the gender division of labor ideal. So that excludes all the women of color who are always working out of necessity and are systematically excluded from achieving that ideal. And this kind of bifurcation of the welfare state does persist today, as we're seeing at CHPC now with a lot of our work on the brutal bureaucracy. The procedures and invasive processes to ensure that mothers or women continue to be deserving of public assistance by providing their good mothering service to society are still present with welfare today. So these ideologies really continued to be reinforced throughout the middle of the 20th century in the New Deal, and then that in turn embedded gender inequality onto the built environment because the nation was going through such transformative growth at the time. So the mass sale and production of single family homes and the marketing of it as the American dream was all founded on this gender division of labor, in which the woman of a household in, suburban 1950s was assigned the role of the homemaker and responsible for facilitating consumption, spending, of course, her husband's money because she had to rely on him for financial support, as part of her overarching obligation to be a good mother and a good caretaker. And still women were discouraged from participating in the labor force after marriage, with the exception of during wartime shortages of labor, when the US has kind of tapped into women as a reserve source of labor. So as those housing policies, with the creation of the FHA, and the FLIC took hold, we started the process of mass producing and selling suburban homes with mortgages widely available to white men. And this, of course, puts women in a role that is both confined to the private home socially, but also physically, because now we were building and designing cities where residential uses are separate from other uses, and transit systems are designed to transport male workers to and from the city centers rather than accommodate women's transit needs. And all of these things still affect women and how they experience quality of life in cities today. Of course, communities of color were systematically excluded from the opportunity of homeownership, and once again excluded from these policies that were designed to promote and favor the male breadwinner household over all others. In the 1970s, large numbers of married white women started to enter the workforce for the first time. And so this caused kind of a shift for the first time in several decades around America's thinking of what a good mother is, and people kind of started more and more to accept that a good mother could be one that worked rather than one who stayed at home. So you'll see that in this chart, the trend of married women in the labor force, it started to accelerate rapidly beginning in the 1970s. However, that did not really facilitate any substantive policy reforms to help women meet society's caregiving needs. I'm not sure how many people know this. I was very surprised to find this out. We almost had federally funded childcare in the US in 1974. Congress passed a bill that would have created a network of federally funded childcare facilities across the nation. President Nixon vetoed it, citing the threats of communism and the dangers that a communal approach to child rearing would pose to American family values. So once again, the US is maintaining this stance that caregiving needs are a matter of the private home and one that women should really be able to just take care of for free, and that the government has no role in that, even when women are matching men's contributions economically. So this actually also has racial implications because the commercialization of care work that expanded drastically during this time with more and more families needing help to do domestic service and caregiving needs, has then kind of, all of those occupations for caregiving have been devalued. And so the women of color who are still performing those roles are getting paid less and working in low wage, low opportunity jobs. Today, American children are far more likely to be raised by a single working parent or two employed parents than one parent who works and one who stays at home. So the male breadwinner ideal is like further gone than ever before, but we really still don't have any type of policies to support women in providing caregiving needs. And those continue to be outsourced through commercial care work for extremely low wages to women and increasingly men also of color. At the same time, we still maintain a welfare system that is characterized by invasive monitoring practices and the dictation of morality and good mothering to women who need assistance. This is a wonderful quote from Jessica Calarco, who's an associate professor at Indiana University, that I think kind of sums it up quite nicely. So that brings us to why we need feminist policies today. There is robust empirical evidence and research showing that feminist policies benefit social and economic health outcomes at large. Of course, a feminist lens is an equity lens, as we now know through the work of Kimberly Crenshaw and all of the other important feminists who have made feminism more inclusive of the voices and needs of women of color over the last few decades. And lastly, but not least, I think as I hope the history section kind of shows, gender neutral is really not enough in this context. We're so used to designing policies based on men and designing cities based on men and designing housing based on men that when we create policies that we think are gender neutral, oftentimes they're not. And even if they are, they would ignore the existing disparities between women and men, and that would just perpetuate an inequitable status quo. So a great example is Social Security. Social Security was created for men back in the 1930s and originally didn't really benefit women that much because women were not supposed to be working. Today, Social Security still perpetuates a lifetime of wage inequality for women who have had lower earnings their whole lives and are more likely to have had to take off time from their careers to fulfill caregiving needs. So that in turn then provides them with lower benefits amounts than men, even though women are more likely to rely on Social Security in their old age. Another example that we got from Feminist City, a book by Leslie Kern, who we did an event with earlier this year, is around the wind tunnel effect in the city of Toronto's design guidelines. So the urban planners at Toronto recently discovered that their design guidelines for the impacts of wind were based on the the area and height and stature of what would be a male body. And so that's not taking into account women and children who are typically smaller and might be able to withstand less wind impact. So it's really a wide range of ways in which gender neutral policies really aren't enough. With that, I'll just move right along into our feminist housing plan recommendations. First, we focus on NYCHA, which, although we don't talk about it as much as we do NYCHA itself, is a feminist issue. Nearly 4 out of 5 households in NYCHA are female-headed. Nearly 1 in 6 are comprised of a single parent or grandparent raising children, and almost 100% of those are headed by women. So unlike the current housing plan, which excludes NYCHA entirely, and where NYCHA is being treated as kind of this other thing that housing agencies need to deal with simultaneously to achieving our real housing goals, we need to integrate NYCHA as a central component of the citywide housing plan and put this crisis front and center. That means where resources and capital financing, et cetera, timelines, where all of those things need to have trade-offs between goals, NYCHA needs to be considered as one of those goals. We need to figure out a way to meet the capital needs of each and every unit, as those will only become costlier and more urgent to address the longer they go on. And as Jessica mentioned, with CHPC's public housing revolution work earlier, we need to position residents at the center of decision-making, both to restore trust and also to help do a better job on redevelopment projects, because tenants have lived experience and knowledge that's really invaluable. Chris talked a lot about this. It's amazing to hear her talk about this after all of the important work she's done, but homelessness is a feminist crisis. 62% of residents in DHS shelters are families with children, and 9 out of 10 of those families are headed by women, overwhelmingly low-income women of color who are raising young children on their own. Also, women, their children, and LGBTQ+ people are more vulnerable to the leading causes of homelessness, with domestic violence being the #1 cause of family homelessness in New York City. Women and LGBTQ+ communities are also more vulnerable to poverty and housing instability. Here in the bottom chart on the slide, you can see the differences in poverty rates between men and women, which are really quite stark. The poverty rate for Hispanic women and Latina women is twice that of the poverty rate for non-Hispanic white males. So when you're in poverty or when you have a very low income, little events like an unexpected cost can trigger housing instability that can then lead to homelessness almost immediately, or cause an eviction, which can then make housing more difficult to obtain down the line. The same is true for domestic violence. Many survivors are dealing with safety and confidentiality needs that we really don't have the resources and capacity in our DV shelter system to address at the scale that they need to, as we only have enough spots in HRA's DV shelters for 1 in 4 survivors experiencing homelessness. And again, LGBTQ+ communities are also disproportionately vulnerable to these issues, especially youth, who are often kicked out of their homes or have to run away after coming out to their families or having their gender identity or sexual orientation discovered in order to escape abuse. So for homelessness, we recommend, again, positioning this as a top priority that must be integrated with our efforts to meet other housing goals. In particular, we need to expand housing and social safety net options to reduce homelessness as the result of domestic violence, understanding that those needs and those options are going to be a little bit different than homelessness as the result of just lack of income. We need to address housing instability among LGBTQ+ youth. And then finally, we need to eliminate regulatory obstacles to the creation of housing resources for the homeless, and specifically find a more appropriate balance between what is invaluable an invaluable component of the land use process, community input, but also the very real housing needs of thousands of New Yorkers experiencing homelessness. Looking at aging, aging is also a feminist issue. 6 out of 10 senior New Yorkers are women, and the senior population is the fastest growing population in the city. The senior population has also demonstrated growing affordability needs that will only continue to increase as the population grows. So senior women are much lower income than senior men. They are more likely to be rent burdened, and they are less likely to own a home. Senior women also live alone at twice the rate of senior men and are more likely to live in poverty, with 1 in 4 female New Yorkers living in poverty by the time she's in her 80s. Women have greater poverty rates and higher poverty rates and greater longevity, which kind of intensify the need for appropriate housing, such as senior housing for some women, and also just the need for affordable housing for seniors in general, and also housing stability programs that can help households that have a good situation with their housing retain it. So a great example is SCREE, the Senior Citizen Rent Increase Exemption Program, helps senior households in rent stabilized housing stay in that housing for a longer period of time. But according to recent estimates, only around half of eligible households are enrolled in SCREE, and 1/3 of participants are still paying more than 70% of their income to rent, which is debilitating when it comes to paying for other basic needs. So we need to both build and invest in more senior housing, and we need to expand programs to support the housing stability of seniors in rent stabilized housing and other situations that they can afford. Moving on to affordability, our housing policies once again treat affordability as a universal experience, but it's really not so. Women obviously have lower incomes, and if you define affordability as 30% of household income, this puts women at an inherent disadvantage. They're going to inherently have fewer options for housing that they can afford at 30% of their income because their incomes are lower. This chart shows the area median income affordability level breakdown of female and male-headed households in New York City. So when we do subsidized housing and we say, this unit is for extremely low income, this unit is for very low income households, this kind of gives you a sense of how many female-headed households are on the extremely and very low end of the spectrum compared to male-headed households. So this definitely needs to inform our priorities around what types of housing we're creating for who. And then, as Chris mentioned, also the concept of 30% of household income being necessarily affordable doesn't really hold up for women, especially when you consider both the lower incomes of women and their greater likelihood to be caring for children on a single income. Childcare expenses are the second greatest, if not sometimes the greatest monthly expense that households face after rent. So we kind of break this down in the housing plan by looking at 3 hypothetical households. You have a married couple whose income together is 80% of AMI. You have a single mom with 2 kids who makes the same salary as one of each of the married couple parents. And then you have a single mom with 2 kids who actually her income is much higher. She's single-handedly earning what the married couple is together. But when you take a look at the monthly expenses for non-housing costs, in addition to the affordable monthly rent at 30% of household income, as you can see in Family B and Family C, because these single moms have 2 kids and because their childcare expenses are so high, even though they're living in affordable housing, and even though Mrs. C in Family C has the same income as the married couple, Mr. and Mrs. A in Family A, she's still not able to keep up with her housing and basic needs because of the high cost of childcare. So this is just a very simple demonstration of how expenses that aren't for housing and income factor into what's affordable and what's not, and how that 30% threshold really needs to be kind of recalibrated to consider other things. So our recommendations for this section are to build more deeply affordable housing that extremely and very low income households will be able to afford, and then to reframe affordability to address income and expenses in our housing policies. Housing design is a feminist issue as well. Our nuclear family only housing regulations that were largely instated during the middle of the century when gendered ideologies were influencing housing policy so much, has created this kind of mismatch between how people are living in New York and what the housing stock is. And so essentially what's happening is all the housing is for nuclear families, but only 16% of households are nuclear families. And so studios and one bedrooms, the demand has far outstripped the supply. They're too expensive for anyone to afford as a single person. Single people then move into family units together in shared arrangements that are often not legal, which has its own implications. And then families can't compete with multiple breadwinners and aren't able to access the housing that was supposedly built for them. All of these things disproportionately impact women and their households who have greater affordability needs. So to address this issue, we can reinvigorate the idea of single adult housing stock, such as SROs, which were largely demolished in the beginning of this century, but when designed and managed well, can provide many benefits, including lower rents and more flexibility than studio and one-bedroom apartments. And then we can also encourage the development of innovative housing typologies that meet women's needs. When it comes to economic inequality, our housing policies, by assuming that affordability is universal, just allows economic inequality in the workforce to kind of multiply in the housing market and deprive women further of access to housing. But housing policy can actually be leveraged to combat those impacts. So as we know, the gender wage gap ensures that women have lower incomes and less access to housing as a result. Women are disproportionately concentrated in low wage jobs and face gendered barriers to opportunities for advancement. Women, the devaluation of women's work, also affects occupational wages. So there's several studies out there showing how over several decades, as the rate of women working in an occupation increases, the pay in that occupation actually declines. So for all the naysayers who say, no, it's not real, women just choose lower paying jobs, it's really not true. Women get paid less regardless. Even men in female dominated occupations will begin to get paid less if that occupation goes from being male dominated to female dominated. This is true in the housing sector just as anything else. Comparing the 86% female home health aide workforce to the 3% female construction workforce, you can see there's far lower starting salaries and salaries for experienced workers. And of course, COVID-19 has exacerbated all of these issues by causing women to drop out of the labor force to fulfill caregiving needs at disproportionate rates and hitting essential workers the hardest, who are disproportionately women. So to combat these effects, we can reserve affordable housing for essential workers and also achieve pay equity for female dominated occupations and housing that are in residential services and care. And then finally, the last section, I'm running a bit behind on time, sorry about that. The last section of the housing plan is around planning and neighborhood development strategies. This is a great quote from Dolores Hayden that once again talks about how gendered ideologies have impacted the way that our cities are designed. In particular, transit needs are unique and greater among women who are less likely to own a car and more likely to rely on public transit, in particular the bus. So we can center housing development around jobs, essential retail, and public transit. We can leverage ground floor spaces to meet community needs, as women need access to lots of different spaces throughout the day that are not just the office and work, but also schools, grocery stores, et cetera, et cetera. We can provide childcare centers and subsidized affordable housing so that women don't have to spend hours and hours per day shuttling children to and from school or from childcare. We recommend requiring a gender equity audit for significant land use actions plans and local laws, a practice that's referred to in Europe as gender mainstreaming, and which has led to some really great outcomes in lots of European cities. And finally, we have to foster diverse women leaders in planning and policy making, because we cannot make a city for everyone unless everyone is at the table. So I'll go ahead and stop there. I know I ran a little bit over, and I want to give us more time to hear from Chris and Jessica.
Well, thank you so much, Sheena. That was amazing. Give Chris some time to get back on. So we want to hear from you. Put your questions in the Q&A or the chat. And also, I really want to make sure that this is the beginning of the conversation and not the end. We're just trying to get a drumbeat started so that we can continue to consider these issues, particularly through this election cycle, but also beyond that into our kind of seeping into our housing policy going forward. You know, like we said at the beginning, while the framing of this report can seem sort of surprising to a housing industry that is accustomed to being kind of bricks and mortar, how can a building have a gender equity perspective? We're just building housing here. As you can see, even though that framing can seem kind of surprising or even radical to people, the policy recommendations that flow naturally from that framing are really very reasonable and are things that we should have been worrying about for a long time. So as the questions roll in, I'll just start with you, Chris. Tell us a little, talk about this report kind of in the context of the election cycle that we find ourselves in. Do we have a female electorate that can look at this from this perspective? What's standing in our way from looking at our policies in New York City through a feminist perspective?
Well, first I want to thank Sheena. Wow, that was a great presentation. And you can tell you know that info like in your bones. So thank you very, very much. You know, I think we don't have a candidate right at the moment who's looking at things this way. I don't think any of the candidates have a housing plan that's really as developed as it should be, in my opinion, which maybe at the end of the day isn't the worst thing in the world, you know, if we're all ready to go in and fill in the blanks. The only thing that's missing is the advocacy to make them see it this way. And I think that with this concept, there'd be a broad base of advocates from the housing community, the homeless community, the feminist community, the real estate community, who would all be willing to push this together. So we just have to decide, which we're kind of doing this morning, that this is going to be an issue we are going to put on the Democratic nominees' agenda, you know, the day after the primary. We'll have no idea who won. When we know in July who won, you know, to make this an issue in the general so it can be an issue in the transition. Because what I think is going to be critical for this kind of an issue is what's the deputy mayor structure? Who's the DHS commissioner? Who's the HPD commissioner? So the transition, I believe, is going to be more critical than usual after this election.
Yeah, one of the main recommendations that we had in our healthcare housing plan is to make sure that the infrastructure and the bureaucracy around homelessness and housing are merged into one deputy mayor.
It will make
really
total sense, because how are we not doing that? Do you know what I mean? Like, how are those folks not talking to each other? It doesn't, and not the same person. It's completely illogical.
Yeah, so we have a question in the chat. Is there any potential for a Barbizon-like models to make a comeback as part of a feminist housing plan? Yeah, I have a dream since I started at CHPC to do an oral history of the ladies' hotels. And Sheena and I tried to be circumspect and not spend 100 pages on it in the report. But I do think that the main, you know, one of the barriers of that housing model is this stigmatization of single people and single women in particular. You know, we'll talk about this at length in our LGBTQ report that I'll just pitch our event that's coming out on June 24th. But the extent to which all of us are suffering from a zoning resolution that was weirdly preoccupied with preventing real or imagined prostitution is very strange. And all of us are kind of living with those results. So this idea that you needed to control the activities of women has created a lot of housing problems down the line, to the point where we forget why those regulations even were in place in the first place. But certainly housing for single people is incredibly important in this feminist housing plan. I don't want to overstate that it's all about women who are raising children. We also have major issues around housing for single people in general, and that particularly affects women even more, particularly seniors in New York City. And we, on the one hand, our laws protect and preserve the few remaining SROs that are left, but then on the other hand, we're not allowed to build any new ones. So that's been a real issue. And I'll just add, in the legislation, there's a bill around hotel conversions right now, and I think we're a little concerned that some of the addition, the latest version of the bill strips out the zoning improvements and the regulatory reforms that we would need to really do it well, and require kitchen facilities in each apartment. So I think both of those things are going to make it much harder to create kind of a modern day Barbizon.
You know, the other thing, I agree with everything Jessica said, particularly about looking at this and demonizing single women. I also think the loss of the Barbizon model, or the Martha Washington Hotel, which is now a shishi restaurant, you know, or other SROs, is also a result in our culture of demonizing low-income people and poverty, right? I mean, there is nothing wrong. It's something to be proud of, that you put in a day's work, and a day's work gets you X amount of money, and X amount of money would pay for a clean, decent room in New York City, right? That's nothing to be ashamed of. But somehow because some of the SROs turned into, you know, very problematic places and had bad landlords, we've now look down on people for whom that was the housing answer. And I think we need to think about that. You know, we as a society gradate the poor. You know, if you are a domestic violence survivor, and 80% of Wynn's moms are domestic violence survivors, you're the worthy poor. You know, and people always lead when we go into communities that we serve domestic violence survivors. But if you're just somebody who doesn't make a lot of money, somehow you're a loser and shouldn't be rewarded with SRO housing.
Yeah, and that extends to our wider social safety net in general. Just to drive home Sheena's point about our 2-channel social welfare system. If you know, I don't want to sound like I'm stigmatizing a bureaucracy. I'm a bureaucrat in my bones. Right. I love a good bureaucracy. I think it's really important to have a good, smart, functioning bureaucracy. And I use that word proudly most of the time. But when somebody files for a mortgage interest tax deduction, if we said, well, what are you going to use the money for? Can we do a quick home visit first? Did you change jobs last year? Can you take your kids down to this office and prove that they exist? Can you give us 6 years of your tax returns? It would be, there's a whole bureaucracy that's dedicated to administering and enforcing the rules of the mortgage interest tax deduction. That is much larger in terms of dollar amount than any social safety net program that we have for poor people. But we're perfectly happy to let that system kind of do its job behind the scenes. We presume you to be eligible. We audit you after the fact. We try to make it as simple as possible. We try to streamline the process of that program with other systems that we're already using. But then when it comes to Section 8 or entrance to supportive housing or food stamps, then all of a sudden we get real curious about other aspects of your life. And that dates back 150 years. It's going to take a big culture shift to unwind the idea that it's not just about following rules. Of course, we should have rules for these programs. Of course, we should follow them. But that we've really created a system that makes it harder to help the people who need our help the most.
Right. And it's very, at its core, puritanical in the way it looks at people.
So with 2 minutes left, I'm just going to thank Quinn for joining us. It's always a pleasure to hear your insight. And Sheena did such a remarkable job on this report. Thank you so much in this presentation. Our next event is on June 24th. It's the launch of our LGBTQ housing plan. That's going to be a lot of fun. So please join us for that one. And thank you again, everybody. And I see some people in the chat saying that they're very mad about this presentation. So I'm just going to ask you all to stay mad about it for a little while longer until we can try to do something about it. So thank you all. Have a great day.
Bye.
Thanks so much.